Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to wish everyone a good evening and a welcome to the lecture for today. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya wa mursalin wa ala sahabati wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawm al-din. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما مما يقربنا إليك. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. الحمد لله. The Arabic that I began with is traditionally mentioned at the start of most Muslim gatherings, and it is nothing more than a prayer and a praise of God Almighty and a sending of prayer and salutations upon all of the great prophets that came to humanity, starting with Adam and ending with the Prophet Muhammad. May God's peace and blessings be upon him. The topic that I've been given to speak about today is a foretold science, insights from Islamic revelation. And it's an interesting topic because we're standing in a university setting, which is something amongst the numerous gifts of the Muslim tradition and the Muslim culture to the world is the very founding and the very establishment of universities. And so for the Muslims, this spirit of learning or this philosophy of learning was something that was inherent and was quintessential to the Islamic identity. And so from the very first revelation itself, where God told the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, that اقرأ بِاسْمِ رَبِّكَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ, that read in the name of thy Lord who created, that herein lied the impetus and the motivation for generations of Muslims that were to follow, that knowledge and learning and education are something that are part and parcel of the Muslim tradition. Because God is worshipped through knowledge. He's not worshipped through ignorance. And so for that reason that there are many sayings of the Prophet which would seek to reinforce that and to drive that home. For example, that أُطْلُبُ الْعِلْمِ مِنَ الْمَهْدِ إِلَى اللَّحْدِ, that seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. And also that this wasn't something which was gender specific, because the seeking of knowledge, it is said that it is obligatory upon every single male or female Muslim. And in another tradition, the Prophet said that seek knowledge even if you have to go into China. Now what's interesting about this is that, of course, the Prophet never left the Arabian Peninsula, and yet he's telling his companions and the later Muslims that are to come that there may be things that would benefit you, and if you have to travel even as so far as to China to gain some benefit from that, then that is part of your identity, that is part of your tradition. And so for the Muslims, that the early Arabs, that these were people, even before Islam came to them, even though they may not have been like the Greeks or the Romans and had large corpuses of literature and philosophy and logic and mathematics, but these were people who had just incredibly vast and prodigious memories. These were people who had an oral tradition that were able to memorize large volumes of poetry, large volumes of information. And so, like for example, like one of the earliest companions of the Prophet, when the Prophet needed for someone in order to communicate with the surrounding Jewish tribes in the area, and wanted for someone to learn Hebrew, that one of his companions, Zayd, that he went and learned the entire Hebrew language in 13 days. And so the point of all of this is that seeking knowledge in Islam and education and research and that drive to gain anything that would benefit you was something that was found within the earliest days of the prophetic mission. And so the Muslim views on science, Muslim views on research and technology, that none of them are incompatible with science. In other words, that ours is a tradition that encourages us to learn, and so not only does it encourage us to learn, but God Himself puts that impetus puts that stimulation within revelation and within sayings of the Prophet to reinforce that, to buttress that. And so therefore we find within the Quran, within the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, that there are scientific facts, that there are scientific phenomena that are mentioned. And so the stimulus then is that here's a taste of what lies ahead. Here's a taste of what lies ahead if you were to stimulate the intellect and if you were to go and to learn. And so human beings are told that they should go and learn. And they're challenged by saying that these signs themselves are proofs of the existence and the veracity of God. That they are proofs that the message that is given to the Prophet ﷺ is true. And so we have not just in terms of macro science, because the Quran says that سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ, which translates to that surely we shall show them our signs in the farthest horizons and in their own selves, until it is manifest to them that what we have revealed is verily the truth. In other words, that Allah, that God, sought to challenge the human beings to look not just on a macroscopic level, not just in the farthest expanses of the universe, but even in their own selves, even within themselves, that to understand and to reaffirm and to feel a sense of consolation and reaffirmation that what they have learned, that this message that they're following, that indeed it is true. And so this was the underlying theme for the early Muslims. This underlying theme was that religion and science were not incompatible. And the great, and this could be a whole different lecture in and of itself, the achievements and the legacies of the early Muslim scientists and scholars. But what's interesting is that all of these scientists, all of these scholars were people who were not just versed in mathematics and chemistry and physics and things like that, but they were well versed within the Muslim tradition itself. In other words, they were religious scholars and they were secular and scientific scholars as well. And it's interesting that, just as one example, that in one of the earliest books of chemistry written by the great scholar Ibn Hibban, in a book that he titles as Kitab al-Sab'in, the Book of 70, he writes in the introduction, he says, "Certainly the mention of God is more noble, majestic, and greater than what follows." And he writes an introduction to this whole treatise on chemistry by saying how important it is for the learner of chemistry to purify his soul, divorce himself from ostentation and materialism, because only this would be a prerequisite for learning science. And so that's the tradition of maturity and cosmopolitanism that the Muslims brought at a time when the rest of the world, particularly Europe, was literally had forgotten their own tradition, had forgotten the legacy of the Greeks and the Romans, and were debating things like whether women were human beings or not, until Thomas Aquinas comes and actually, even in the 15th century, that this was one of the discussions they had. So the point is that the Muslims not only inherited the Greek and the Roman tradition and also the Hindu tradition, but took it one step further with that religious motivation, that what they were learning, that what they were studying was something that would bring them closer to God.